Ladies and gentlemen, Derek Lambert. I'm the host of this channel, MythVision. I have Dr. Kipp Davis hanging out with me today. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing well. It's hot out there.
It is. Florida is, beyond purgatory and closer to
I don't know
Hades.
why anyone would live here, but
But listen, it wasn't my choice. I know Christians say I send myself there, but I'm telling you, this was
you
done.
came just to be close to the big Scientology center over there in Clearwater.
You caught
right?
me.
Yeah. I
Shit.
get it, Derek. I get it.
I didn't want you to say that on public TV. Anyways, we're gonna discuss the young man who's running from the garden and is depicted as nude. And in some art, he is depicted as nude. And why are we doing this? Well, let me give a little context myself as to why this is the first time I'm even speaking out about this, because my buddy Neil, Gnostic Informant, has made relationship in learning Greek to Ammon Hillman, classicist, whose specialty, I'll say, is focused on drugs mainly, who's learned Greek through the years. And I've got some stuff in the works that you're going to want to stay tuned for that actually is dealing with primary sources that Ammon has actually quoted from friends who know Greek. And they're going to be doing that special themselves. But in this particular interview, I want to highlight, first of all, I'm going to be putting a little documentary together that's well polished, telling you the interpretation of the naked young man in Mark from a classicist from Harvard, who I said classicist and Bible scholar. He's both. Can you believe there is the existence of both? And that is Dennis R. MacDonald, who actually said this whole idea that Ammon's interpretation, again, censoring this to some degree because YouTube would shut us down and I would not be able to monetize. And that is Jesus practically is a drug addict who's overdosing, who's needing to extract semen in order to cure his overdose from this young man. And the word boy gets thrown in there. And he gets arrested in the process for child trafficking, gets hung on a cross and overdoses.
This is to do with child traffickers.
Right. And this Lestes, of course, ends up getting arrested and gets crucified, and in the midst of it, overdoses and dies. And there's the sponge with the wine and the drug there and all that. So, okay, deep breath. So there's a lot there. It's quite
A
a
lot there, yeah.
ear-catching, sensational, holy smokes.
People glom onto this stuff, right? It's interesting. It's captivating.
It is.
It's provocative. It's scandalizing. I never heard that before. What is the church trying to keep from me?
Exactly.
Right?
This is exactly what Morton Smith, not this exact thing, but decades ago, Morton Smith postulated an interpretation like, not the full-on details that Ammon's done, but ultimately Jesus was with this young boy in this initiation situation in a garden, and it is homoerotic, okay? So it's not new. Dennis MacDonald did a lecture giving an alternative interpretation, and Morton Smith stood up, and you know from being at lectures how scholars will pick other scholars apart and combat each other's ideas.
Scholars are crazy, dude.
It was really bad. Dennis said he stood up at the end and he started yelling at him. And was yelling at him about how wrong he was. 2 weeks later, Morton Smith died. 2 weeks later, scholars would go to Dennis and say, "You killed him. What did you do?" So
It's just, if you've ever met Dennis MacDonald, it's the most hilarious thing, because is there a nicer man on earth
I don't think
than Dennis? A nicer, more soft-spoken man on earth than Dennis MacDonald?
I don't. He's so nice. Me and Ryan talk about it all the time. Every phone call we have, it's immediate. How's your wife? How's your children?
Oh, yeah.
He cares so much.
I can only imagine how mortified Dennis would be at the suggestion that,
he chuckles because he knows that that's not the case. But he told me when I mentioned Ammon's position, because I don't know these languages. I go to the experts. I like to learn what experts say from various angles. And he said, that's absurd. He said, this interpretation is just absurd. It's not taking serious the whole Gospel of Mark contextually.
Yes.
And
It's not taking serious just the pericope itself, just the story itself.
Right.
And the reason for that, I think, is because when people become captivated by this idea, it's because they've only entered the text through this lens that Ammon Hillman has set on the text, and they're only hearing his reading of the text. In fact, as you were talking about this, like this is something that I have encountered a lot ever since I started engaging with some of the work of Ammon Hillman. On one of my videos, uh, a comment left here in all caps, "What was Jesus doing at 4 a.m. with a naked kid yelling, 'I am not a lay stays'?"
Right.
That's Ammon's reading.
And that's what people are walking away interpreting it at. Yeah.
Importantly, and it's really important that people hear this, that is not what the text says. It's not.
Yeah.
All you have to do, and I mean, let's get all our cards on the table here. I'm not a New Testament scholar.
Got it.
This is not my field. I mean, I have to work with the New Testament as a specialist in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in early Judaism.
Yep.
And I deal with Greek literature all the time. But all that being said, this is no, I don't know the deeply nuanced positions about how this text functions within the literature, and I don't think you even have to. All you have to do is read the text, Eric. So let's read the text to see what this actually says. And I'm going to start, I'm not just going to zero in on Jesus's statement there and on the appearance of the young man. We're going to look at this entire story within its context. This appears in Mark chapter 14, and I'm going to read here starting at verse 43. Immediately, while he was speaking, I'm reading from the NRSV, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with him there was a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." So, when he came, he went up to him at once and said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. Then they laid hands on him and arrested him. But one of those who stood near drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to them, "I am not a laystes." No, I'm kidding. He didn't say that, guys. That's not what Jesus said.
Exactly. Exactly.
So what does Jesus say? "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a robber or a laystes?
Right.
Day after day, I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me, but let the scriptures be fulfilled." So what is Jesus actually saying here? When he responds to when he responds to the people who have come to arrest him, what is he saying? To put this another way, he is telling them that I've been among you. This whole time, I was in your presence. You had ample opportunity to come after me, to come at me, bro,
Right.
and you never took that opportunity. And now, when I'm, alone in the garden with my people in the dark, you've come and arrested me as though I was a common criminal,
Right.
a laystes. So the way that Ammon Hillman has presented this text, the way he presents Jesus' statement, which he dramatically paraphrases to say something like, "Don't look at me, I'm not a bandit or
A
a child
trafficker.
trafficker,"
Ah,
which is not what he's saying. That is just not what he's saying.
I think it's really, really odd because when I've had experts come in, we're dealing with a document, Mark, that is clearly aware, according to the critical scholars, of the Roman Jewish War. Now, even Christians will acknowledge, well, he's prophesying, he knows the future, so he knows the Roman Jewish war is coming, but you have to have Roman Jewish war in mind. I mean, look at Mark
Uh,
9, really Mount of Olives, like he is pointing to it, not a stone will be left upon another. Like there is a significant temple destruction being pointed out here. And for
yes.
those who know Josephus, and I do not know these languages either, but I definitely don't know them as much as you do, even the Greek. Um, the experts I've spoken to will point out that these robbers were these militant rebels in the temple, and they were being called this by Josephus as well. So, one interesting facet when you and I were doing a deep dive on Michael Jones and dealing with this idea about the two donkeys,
Yeah.
well, we found this parallelism running through the Gospel of Mark. Sometimes it's interesting to just look at Matthew and understand how does he interpret Mark? Doesn't
Oh,
mean
yeah.
Mark
Oh, that's a
meant
very good idea.
yeah,
Yeah.
it doesn't mean Matthew means what Mark's saying, but it's helpful sometimes to see what he's doing. And what you
It's
find is
insight into the culture and into you're getting closer to a time. There's Matthew's a reader of Mark.
right,
So what does Matthew understand when he's reading Mark?
exactly. And when that part comes up where there's Barabbas and Jesus, there's something interesting that is missing from Matthew that is in there in Mark. And Dallas C. Allison Jr., the expert on Matthew,
Mhm.
highlights this. And I went into that chapter. First things first, the name of the character in Mark is Jesus Barabbas in the earliest manuscripts.
Mm.
So they scratch his name Jesus out because they don't want him even being that close to Jesus. They call him Barabbas. So it's a pun, son of the Father. Jesus Barabbas, son of
Yeah.
the Father, and Jesus, the Christ. Okay, so there's two models of Christ here. One is a murderer, and one, if you just read the story, is not. Okay. It tells you like he's not a murderer, but they'd rather have a murderer. So now we have to explain why the temple is going to come down on them
Yeah.
and why Jerusalem is destroyed by Rome. Because you wanted murderers instead of the Christ, the true Messiah. The whole story is telling you this.
Yes.
Well, Matthew does not tell you that. And it literally tells you in Mark that he is being accused, right? That Barabbas is being accused of being part of the inciting of the war. He is part of this lestes, robbers that are going in, that are actually trying to invoke combat and fight against Rome. And Jesus is not. And so what Matthew does, according to Allison, is say, let's remove that phrase where he's part of this war kind of situation and the name Jesus to get him as far away. We have to keep Mark, but we also want to get rid of a little bit of Mark here so readers don't possibly put Jesus even too close to the Roman Jewish war and this guy. They're already trying to make Jesus better and furthering him away from the war
Yes.
cause that's happening. And I think that's important to
Very
emphasize.
important. Yes.
So we're
Absolutely.
dealing with rebels in the Jewish Roman War.
And this is I think Ammon draws a lot of capital when he goes and looks at a lexicon entry for the word lay stays
Right.
in order to the way lexicons work. This is a fancy word for a dictionary, usually of ancient literature. Um, Lexicons work in the form of providing glosses of potential meanings for words uh, based on their usage within the context in which they're used. It becomes pretty complicated because you have to then decide, what kind of a text am I reading? What's going on within this text before you can arrive at the appropriate interpretation, translation of the word, right? Because words aren't so static all the time. They don't always just mean this one thing.
Right.
They can mean a variety of things.
Exactly.
So, and language changes.
So you're trying to tell me that a lay stace isn't necessarily a one-eyed pirate on a ship
It's not
that's
not a
robbing
child
people?
trafficker, no.
Oh, okay.
So now, what we have in the Liddell Scott Jones Greek lexicon, which is the lexicon of the collected works of the entire ancient Greek world. So this includes all sorts of
Genres,
different genres from
cultures.
different times and cultures and places. So the very first entry here is robber or pirate.
Got it.
And it also means, especially by sea, a buccaneer. Um,
And that's the
it
one that gets emphasized.
this is the one that gets emphasized, and I think Ammon also reads this through Caesar's Gallic Wars, where he tells the story of being captured by pirates and who wanted to sell him into slavery, and calls them, you know,
Laces.
laces,
Right.
and has them crucified. So, once he's free of them and back in power. So I think he's reading all this stuff through this lens, but importantly, what's missing is this really critical piece that you have picked up on here in looking at Matthew and especially looking at Josephus. Importantly, these are texts that are written by Hellenistic Jews.
Right.
So they have their own sense, their own feeling of what this word means. And it's not necessarily going to mean the same thing
Right.
that Caesar
Exactly.
meant when he used this word. And in particular, at the time in which the Gospels were written, at the time in which some of a lot of the Hebrew literature was being translated into Greek, this same word had a tendency to be used with reference to these insurrection movements. It had to do with rebellion. It had to do with fighting against the powers like Rome. So that's the proper way in which we need to read these texts in a place like the Gospel of Mark.
Absolutely. I like the way you're painting this contextually. So we're going to get to an interpretation for those of you who haven't heard an alternative that have been absolutely not only enthralled by, which is quite shocking to hear someone interpret it that way and you've never heard it. We're going to give you an alternative one.
Yeah.
But before we do that, your point about Josephus, about why is Jesus being arrested? And this is an important point because as soon as he gets arrested and goes through these trials, right?
Yep.
What happens? Romans show up. This young man flees and ends up becoming nude in the process of fleeing. It's not he's nude in the garden and then the whole time he's fleeing. Go ahead.
Yeah, so no, I'll just, what was Jesus doing at 4 a.m. with a naked kid?
Right.
Again, shall we look at the text and see what actually happens?
Yeah.
Because I think we can discover some things about this.
Well, I
So,
think it's go ahead. Go ahead.
no, no, let's read it, shall we? So Jesus makes this statement to shame the people who are arresting him about not being the criminal they think he is, and says, day after day I was in the temple teaching and you did not arrest me, but let the scriptures be fulfilled. And that's an important feature here. One of the things that Mark is trying to do is show that the things that happen to Jesus are in fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies.
Right.
So the very next verse 50 says, all of them deserted him and fled. And I think this is a very important point of this story. The writer of the Gospel of Mark really wants to emphasize that Jesus was alone and that his followers abandoned him.
Right.
And then the very next thing that's mentioned is this: a certain young man was following him wearing nothing but a linen cloth. Not nothing. He wasn't wearing nothing. He was wearing nothing but a linen cloth. The Greek actually says it was a fine linen over top of his nakedness, is the way they describe it. So it then says they caught hold of him. That would be, the guards and the thugs that the priests hired to come and arrest Jesus. So they caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth in their hands and ran off naked.
Yeah.
So the first thing I want to point out is that Jesus is not in the garden at 4 a.m. with a naked boy.
He becomes nude through the fleeing process and the linen drops. By the way, this is important because first thing I gotta say to those who are not like maybe thinking in an academic way and just like really wooed by some of the sensationalism and entertainment that I think I'm
Yeah,
bringing forward
yeah.
is that you nor I identify as Christian. We do not identify as believers in this. We're not apologists. We are literally saying it doesn't matter if
Mm,
he really was caught with the young man, like
makes no
wouldn't
difference.
matter to me. We just literally want to like
I
be
just wanna
like
know what the text says,
exactly like
right?
what's really happening here. And I think it's interesting, jumping ahead a little,
Okay.
he flees away naked, Sanhedrin show up. Peter denies Jesus and weeps, right? Oh gosh, they just all forsake him, including this naked young boy,
Yeah.
right? Who
Young
would
man.
young man.
We'll have to get
We have to be very careful about because I'm just caught up
yep.
using that, right? Now he has to face Pilate. Okay. So he's in the face of Pilate. And I think this is important. I know later that he's facing both. He goes to Herod and then he goes to Pilate. But like in this, Pilate is asking him, like, are you claiming to be this king? Like, he's already trying to get him as this like usurper messiah type figure. And Josephus covers many examples of messiahs.
Yeah.
Acts goes into this. These are troublemakers. Okay. They are the lestes. Okay. This is an important point. If you don't know the context, you're going to run around thinking, "Arr, matey, give me that human body. I'm selling little man to you." Like, I'm being silly,
But it's wild, like,
but
how does this broader context from Josephus fit into whatever Ammon is trying to do? Like,
it
it
doesn't.
just makes it it makes an nonsensical caricature of the Greco-Roman world, the
If
Roman
if
Empire at the
he
time.
said, I think if he was more careful, which he's just having fun and people are like taking him as gospel, and he said, "Listen, I want to try and interpret this stuff, but I'm going to use the Greek this, and I'm going to go to these other pieces of literature and suppose through the lens that they're doing this. Okay, go with your wild speculations and have fun. It still wouldn't get you closer to what probably is actually happening here. I want to defend the notion before you go, what the heck, man? You guys are like beating around the bush. Give me the what? Why is he a guy with a linen and he's nude? First things first, this guy shows back up. Okay.
Yeah.
For those who don't know, Dennis MacDonald, I've got something coming where we're going to highlight this. But he shows up, and guess what? He's fully clothed and he's in the tomb, fully clothed with the linen. Okay. Um, for those who don't know Paul, this is the apostle who is predating these gospels, and many scholars see Mark as inspired by Pauline literature. He's in the vein of Paul. There's an important thing we need to notice, and I want to bring up this image that I have here that highlights something that Dennis MacDonald, actually, better yet, I'll just read what Dennis says here. Dennis, in his response to me pertaining to Hillman, he points out that Paul, who wrote before Mark, says, quote, and this is in Galatians 3:27, as many of you who were baptized into Christ have put on Christ
Mm.
like a garment.
Well, that's awesome.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's that? That's baptism. What is baptism? It is a ritual that means you are participating in his death. The garden is right before he faces trial to face death. You are participating in his death, and then you're putting on a new garment. You're putting on Christ.
Yeah.
And you are rising with him. Okay. There's some powerful symbolism in this initiation into the Christ movement, into becoming immortalized with Christ.
Yeah.
What? You see what I mean?
Yeah, totally. And I think it's kind of wild to me. It's sort of peculiar to me that very often when I encounter Ammon Hillman's reading of the New Testament, it's striking how traditional and conservative it is because he tends to be treating the text, in my opinion, as if these are straightforward historical documents,
Got it.
providing a picture of what actually happened. And it's really important. The point you're making is crucial to our understanding of what's happening in the texts because the texts are works of literature. They are largely fiction.
Right.
I believe they have some basis in things that did actually happen. Yes, I believe there was actually a Jesus. Yes, I believe he preached up and down the Jordan River Valley between the Galilee and Jerusalem. Yes, I believe that he had followers and was arrested by the Romans and executed. Like, I think these are all things that probably happened, right? But the gospel story is a clever, all of the individual gospels are cleverly constructed narratives illustrating theological truths. And if you're not keyed in on this, and if you're not sensitive to the literary value of these texts, apart from what they're doing with the actual history, you're going to miss the point
Yeah.
entirely. So, like, I mean, let's just deal with first Ammon's reading of this small little bit from Mark and see exactly what's going on and how he's wrong about it. First of all, the word here is that there was a neoniskos following him. Ammon will tell you that this is a little boy. It is not. Neoniskos is a word in Greek that is used with enormous frequency to refer to young men.
Right.
So a young man, someone in their late teens, someone in early adulthood. Very importantly, this is not a little boy. Secondly, he's following him, as we mentioned, wearing nothing but a linen, a single linen garment over top of his nakedness.
Right.
So that's just it's the expression, it's the way that things are expressed in Greek. The linen itself, the garment, can be taken in a handful of these really obscure medical texts to mean like
Bandage.
a medicated bandage or something, but that's as we'll go on to talk about, and as you've already alluded to, this is not faithful to the larger picture that's being painted in Mark, which is about something entirely different.
Right.
It's not about something that actually happened.
Yeah.
Importantly, right? Mark is trying to tell a story that illustrates this critical thing that Paul is drawing out about being uh putting on but how did he put it? Being putting on the new garment of life,
Yes,
right?
it's the garment of Christ, you're putting on Christ, and what I find ironic is the earliest Christian rituals of baptism, when they went to be baptized, they would remove their garments to enter the water, which was burial, immersion, baptism, which is a common mystery religion move,
Sure.
and they'd be baptized going in to death and coming out anew, wrapping themselves in white linen. So this is extremely important contextually when you understand that they are dying and rising with Christ and becoming immortalized in tune with the pneuma. This is all Pauline. And this is the early evidence we have in Paul's letters that hint at what Mark's doing with this fanciful narrative that, hey, these guys, they forsook him. So did, in a sense, you can put yourself in the picture in the garden as a believer. That's the point. You can put yourself
Sure they
in there and flee with them
Yeah,
because you're not going to stick around,
yeah,
but
absolutely.
you're going to be there when he rises and you're going to, you know what I mean?
And then one more important thing to point out here too is the linen garment that Ammon will translate as a medicated bandage. He says is over top of his nakedness,
Yeah.
which he understands to be his genitalia.
Yeah.
He
He said,
says his genitals are wrapped in this medicated bandage because there's this weird, freaky, ritualistic thing happening in the garden. This is nonsense. Uh, Nakedness is not the same thing as genitals. He's wearing the linen robe, which is like a burial cloth, a shroud, basically, in this text over top of his whole body. It's not just restricted to his to junk.
right, right. This kind of reaches back to our previous episode pertaining to kind of the Hebrew or the Greek, right? And I love highlighting scholars who aren't limiting themselves to only scripture when they're analyzing the gospels. However,
Mhm.
no one, even those who are reaching beyond the Hebrew scriptures or the Septuagint to understand New Testament, are limiting them. None of them are denying that scripture's in use here. They're saying there's more going on, right?
Yeah.
But when we think of the idea of nakedness, though we're dealing with Greek,
Mhm.
when we think of nakedness, wow, there are some really interesting ways that the Hebrew Bible and the Septuagint, I imagine, are playing with this motif. Ham saw his father's nakedness.
Right. Yes.
Does that mean he saw his junk downstairs? Well, there are interpretations, right? Is it he did this or did that? There's later nakedness passages even in the law where it describes that if you sleep with your father's wife, that you have
Yeah.
uncovered his nakedness. Hold on. So what does nakedness mean there? His phallus? No, it's describing you have obviously an intimate thing that's going on here. But like what I'm saying is nakedness could have different meanings and
Yeah.
possible
Yeah.
interpretations here in the context. And it's not just that. So I say that,
You can go back to the Garden of Eden
right.
for this too,
That's
right?
why I think there's a hint here. The Garden of Gethsemane, it may
Right.
be hinting
Yes.
back to the Garden of Eden. And there is this almost like we fell like Adam, okay?
Yeah.
We did like Adam, we didn't follow through, but the Christ did.
Yeah.
And we were ashamed of it. We're
So,
shamed. You see what I'm saying?
you know what's happening with the nakedness in the Garden of Eden, which is really intriguing, and it's something that you only tease out if you know the original languages. The word for naked in Hebrew that's used there in Genesis chapter 3, 2 and 3 is arum. Now, at the very end of Genesis chapter 2, God, creates, he literally builds or fashions Eve out of a rib that he's pulled out of Adam. And Adam delivers this lovely poem: "You are bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. A man shall leave his mother and father and cleave to his wife, and they
Mhm.
shall be
One
one
flesh.
flesh." And then the story concludes by saying the man and the woman were naked, harum, in the garden, and they were not ashamed. The very next sentence in this story is this: "Now the serpent, the Nachash, was more clever than all the animals that God created."
Mhm.
The word translated there as clever is arum. Another way to say this is the serpent was more naked
Mm.
than all the other creatures that God had created. So there's an obvious play on words here, and this plays into, we won't get into this, but this whole story has these really interesting deep themes of sex and nakedness
Yep.
and knowledge and immortality, all
Correct.
sort of built into this. And the snake or the serpent is a natural choice as a creature who is naked or clever because he sheds his skin every year, right?
Mhm.
So that's something that plays into the imagery here, insofar as the story of the Garden of Eden is concerned.
And I'm not even saying necessarily the Garden of Gethsemane is lifting its imagery from it, but
It's
if we
something
were
we need
to,
to consider, though.
yeah, we should consider it because immediately they flee, they're naked, and what is the next story about? Peter's denial. He's
Sure.
ashamed.
Yeah.
He's
Yeah.
ashamed.
Right.
So you kinda wonder, "Okay, hold on. What's going on with the garden here?" And then the other fascinating part is you kinda have to factor in some of the philosophy of this
Hmm.
time. Christians are very ascetic early on. In fact, it was so bad that early second century Christians have to then like write passages in the name of Paul saying, you need to procreate if you're going to be saved. It's like they are abstaining from sexual union. They are purposely, and what does Jesus say in Matthew? The eunuch is the highest you can go. Not the sleep with little boys and try to, like this kind of stuff.
Some are fortunate enough to be eunuchs by birth.
Yes, so that achievement in their mind of abstaining or avoiding the flesh at
Mhm.
all cost is something that we see a lot in the literature and in Paul. And so why are we needing to go with the most, I'm going to say the most physically interpretation view of Christianity rather than the ascetic angle that I think they're really thriving
That's
for.
really important. I think what you're pointing out here, right? That this idea of almonds just does not fit. It stands out like a sore thumb. You can't really get this into everything that we know
Right.
about the earliest forms of Christianity. I think like a lot of this, I think, is born out of his own personal experiences. You've heard Ammon tell his story about how he was treated when finishing his PhD and while working at a Catholic college in the Midwest.
Right.
You know, and I think when you hear him talk about this story, and then when you hear him talk about modern religion, again, he's reading all of this stuff through this lens, and I think he's picking up on some really, really important, I would say, certainly much more important themes and ideas than anything we're talking about now. The terrible child sexual abuse
That has happened.
crisis
Continue.
in the Catholic Church. I think he is reacting against this, but in so doing, inappropriately reading this back into the roots of
Mhm.
Christianity, and I just don't think you can get there.
Right.
And if it's not true, I don't think we should do that.
Got it. Got it.
There are absolutely reasons to be extremely critical and um, oppositional to the crimes of the modern Catholic Church.
Yeah.
But we can't draw that stuff into our interpretations of antiquity because you're talking about something completely different.
So if I'm gonna go to bat just a little bit on a possible homoerotic
Mm,
interpretation,
yeah.
and I say
Okay.
possible because, again, like all interpretations of academics who investigate, this is not the most like the common number one go-to interpretation. And that is with my conversation with Jennifer Bird in the past about an academic who he himself identifies as homosexual.
Hmm.
And this is important because Morton Smith himself was known or understood by everyone to also be homosexual, which meant he had same sex relationship, at least desires. Whether he acted on them or not, it doesn't matter to me. It's just the point is that behind the motivation of interpretation, may actually be a psychological reason to derive this conclusion. And some have suggested, and some defend this. I have friends who think that it's authentic, that he did not fabricate the secret gospel of Mark. Others say that he did fabricate it. Most say he did, others say he didn't. However, in the secret gospel of Mark, you can see the homoerotic kind of tendencies. And so, if I'm going to go to bat to at least defend an early idea that there's possibility here, it would be in the Gospel of John, and it would be the beloved disciple. Some of the hints in the language describing his relationship and his contact with him is similar to kind of you see with Jonathan and David.
Yeah.
If you ask academics, are they in love? Yes. But are they in homoerotic? Well, some say yes and some say no. I tend to look at Gilgamesh and Enkidu and think David and Jonathan sometimes have overlap in that kind of relationship. Okay.
And importantly, I think, Jennifer Bird has written a book about coupling and marriage in the Bible that I would encourage everyone to check out because it's really great. But she makes this point abundantly clear. And I think this is something that people often miss within antiquity, within the biblical literature. Marriage and sex were
One and the same.
understood differently, right?
Oh, yeah.
And the idea of coupling with a woman and coupling with a man were different things altogether, and you did them for different reasons,
Right.
right?
Right.
Marriage or a coupling with a woman was really just a very utilitarian thing. It's something you had to do because that's how you procreate. That's how you repopulate and extend the species. What was absolutely critical for the biblical writers and readers, who were all men, was to extend your name and your line, and this is the only way you do it. So love didn't really ever have anything to do with it. Certainly, these relationships get romanticized,
Exactly.
but it wasn't a priority, right? You didn't have to love a woman to marry her or to couple with her or to have sex with her.
Right.
The goal was to produce children. And within that ethic, then you also see the sexual relationship between men quite differently.
Right. Right.
So
I
whether or not, Jonathan and David were lovers, maybe they were, maybe they weren't,
Yes.
doesn't matter.
And this is, I guess, what I'm getting at is a lot of these, the ones that will interpret, the scholars that interpret John specifically. It's
Yes.
John. Now, Morton might have went to Mark, but he had secret gospel Mark that was helping him to interpret Mark, and people think he fabricated secret
Yes.
gospel. Some say he didn't. It's authentic. Either way, it doesn't matter. In John, here he is painted as this philosopher, and for those who don't know, really wise and powerful, important philosophers would have boy lovers, so to speak, or at least young men as lovers. You can go through all the Greek words and do it.
Yeah.
So if they're portraying artistically in that gospel, painting Jesus, which is a very different than the synoptic gospels we have, um, but painting him as a philosopher with a lover boy, or a young man that the beloved, okay, then maybe. I don't know. I mean, he kisses him, but Jonathan and David kiss, Enkidu and Gilgamesh kiss. And so like,
Judas and Jesus cast.
right, but yeah, come on. I was gonna say too, the betrayer. I was thinking of the garden connections of Ark, and I was thinking of the serpent, and I was thinking in some way maybe they're
Yeah.
interpreting
Well,
Judas as the serpent and
yeah,
saying,
honestly, I mean, there are so many layers, Derek,
right,
because I mean, within rabbinic interpretations of that story in Genesis, this is a sexual encounter,
yeah.
right, between the serpent and the woman. So I about God,
Yeah, but what interpretations can go forever. I just wanted to say that, like, to show that we're not even closed off to it at all, that there's the possible interpretation there for John. And if he's aiming at a Greek audience, because many scholars point out the way he speaks of Jews in that gospel is not as favorable. So it's clear that the audience and the author themselves seem to not be so Jewish, let me say. Maybe they're aiming at a more Greek audience with this gospel.
okay,
And
yeah,
if that's the case, when like, you Jews are of the devil, your father, the devil, Satan, like, their scholars would go, man, this sounds like more like he's targeting condemnation to Jews who keep accusing Christians and they're the bad guys. And he might be going toward a Greek Gentile audience more so. And if that's the case, why not portray him in that way? I do see a lot of overlap with Dionysus and Jesus and
sure.
John. And so if that's the case, by the way, Dionysus also had a male lover.
Mm.
So, again, we can interpret things and not, maybe it's right, maybe it's not. But in Mark, the context, I think, is important in understanding what we've spelled out today and be correct in what we're saying. He's not saying, I'm not a lay stays, like, guilty, don't catch me, you did a good job on dispelling that out.
Yeah.
Maybe we should dispel that. But I guess why I even wanted to do this video, Kip, is this. I get hundreds of comments. Hundreds.
I
There's a
read one for you.
wave of Ammonites, I like to call them, that, you know, like what he says goes. This guy has like broken the world with his interpretation and he has it all figured out. And while I love his enthusiasm, I really love the
It is
enthusiasm.
it is infectious,
It's
and I think
infectious.
I think, I think Ammon is primarily an entertainer
Yes, I do too.
and a mystic, and I think this is what really is attractive to people when they're watching him and
Yeah.
listening to him, and I get it, and that's persuasive and
Right.
it's compelling, but it's just wrong.
Yeah, and this isn't wrong because of sacrilege or,
No.
some other accusation that I can
It's
imagine
wrong
for it.
because you're not reading the text
Let's deal
properly.
with this. Let's
Yeah.
go to your pirates on ships that are really doing this, like the Laystes that captured Dionysus,
Yeah.
okay? They're real pirates trying to, like, leverage him for booty, not
Yeah.
literal booty. Should have probably for, like, under for that booty, you know what I'm saying? So they're leveraging it for the money, right?
Mhm.
Like, to
And
let's go get the money from the family and give us Dionysus, or we'll give you Dionysus, you give us a payment. That's human trafficking in a way.
sure,
They're
of
literally
course
doing
it
that.
is. Yes.
It may not be in our contemporary sense of human trafficking in the sense that people are doing sex trafficking and stuff. It's probably for other reasons. He's an important figure. We know he's somebody important. We need to get our money out of him by selling him back to the parents as kind of a someone might do today, but it's not in the same vein of like sexual stuff. So I guess what I'm getting at is like I there's so much noise and comments from people, and I've never responded
Mm.
to them. I never say, "Hey, yeah, I can't wait to have Ammon on to talk about this thing," because I already from the beginning realized, like, man, this is so sensational and so cringy to me that
Yeah.
I'm like, I've got academics who are speaking to me, and we're gonna put something polished together to make some
Yeah.
noise. I
That's
felt like I needed to do this show just to kind of say
sure.
where I'm at
Yeah.
so that they can like understand, okay, Derek has a difference of opinion. And if you think Ammon's words are the gospel, go for it. But you're
Mhm.
barking up the wrong tree if you think that I'm swayed by authority. I'm swayed by I have classical Greek knowledge because I have like I'm not going to exaggerate. I have at least 10 go-to experts in Greek. All 10 of them disagree with Ammon on this. They know Greek. They know classical literature. They understand this material, and they do not walk away interpreting it that way. And they're not going, I don't like this guy. I must disagree with him. They're like, what did he interpret it as? What?
There's actually video floating around of an old lecture that Ammon actually gave, in an academic setting with one of his mentors, Carl Rook, in the audience, and he promotes this reading of Dionysius as a little boy, and, in the audience, Carl Rook, the great classicist, actually corrects him on the fly and says, "No, that's a young man." I mean, it's this is not the establishment out to shut down, Ammon Hillman, who's courageously standing alone against the corrupt authorities. No, this is just the sensible way to read the text. But I wonder if maybe, finishing up here, because I don't know if we fully tease this out, but we should also say something about this young man, this Dionysius, who does make a reappearance in the story of the Gospel of Mark.
Right.
So, like, as you've already talked about, reading Mark through Paul, this is all about baptism and death to the self and rebirth into Christ. But very importantly, the way that Mark very cleverly draws these ideas out into this story is through the reappearance of the young man in the tomb of Jesus.
Right.
And again, he shows up. The how does the story go? The women, yeah, you want to
Yeah, we should probably even
take
read
a
it
look at?
because you read earlier.
Yeah,
Yeah, you did a good job of narrating that. And obviously, we need to understand that we're dealing with certain passages that were original to this gospel and then others that were tacked on, which that's a whole different discussion on the post the end, I think it was verse 8, and then 9 through, what is it, 20 was added later to try and, like, deal with
yes,
the problem
yes, exactly.
because it's a serious problem.
It
And
is.
Dennis MacDonald's interpretation is fascinating.
It's
What
pretty
did that
good.
Alright, so, Mark 16, verse 1. Now, when the Sabbath was passed, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices that they might come and anoint him. I'm reading from the New King James Version. It's probably there's probably you already know English translations. Anyway, very early in the morning on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb when the sun had risen. And they said among themselves, probably on the way, who will roll away the stone to the tomb when the sun had risen? And
It's a
and
good question.
yeah, but when they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away,
Can
for
we
it was
answer?
very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a long white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him, as he said to you." So they went out quickly and fled from the tomb, for they trembled and were amazed, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So, and the whole afraid thing also comes back up, which is interesting because they were afraid in the garden, then they fled. They're afraid here and told no one. The women did. But that young man is clothed and he's no longer not clothed, according to
Yes.
the fleed with no linen. But in baptismal ritual, in that early phase, and I imagine for centuries, they would go in, remove their articles of clothing, enter into the tomb or into death, facing death in the
Yeah.
water, come up and then be clothed in white garments, white robes.
Yeah.
This was a ritual. And so why do what you know,
Very importantly, the young man that is in the tomb there, it's the same word, guys. It's the neoniskos. And I just looked it up here. It's within the entire Gospel of Mark, the first time this word is used, neoniskos, is in chapter 14, verse 51, the young man in the garden. The next and last time that this word is used in the entire Gospel of Mark is in chapter 16, verse 5. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man.
and so common sense question for those who want to take the gospel as like literal historical, as Ammon is kind of painting it.
Yeah.
Do you think the abused young man who fled from him for fear of his life from this child trafficking situation is going to show up inside the guy's tomb? Eh, like, what,
It's what the hell is he doing there?
what's the point?
Is he what happens to this story if he's a little boy now instead of a young man? Like it just it you guys, it just this all of this starts to really strain the limits of
Right.
credulity.
Right. Anyway, Kip, any final words from you? There's so much we could probably get into, but I have friends who know the Greek and they're going to get into the bandage stuff.
And
And we can go.
that's really good.
Yeah.
I think maybe finishing up, it's this, and I'm here in this terrible, humid, hot place you call Florida because I'm going to be doing an interview with Danny Jones in a few days. And one of the things that we're going to be talking a lot about is a scholar by the name of John Marco Allegro, who was one of the original editors of the Dead Sea Scrolls. He's a fascinating character. He wrote a freaky deaky weird book called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. But I think one of the things that I would finish up with in this conversation is that John Marco Allegro was, I think, a lot like Ammon Hillman. He was a bit of an iconoclast. He was someone who saw himself in opposition to the powers that be. He was anti-authoritarian. He was disestablishmentarian, which is cool. I mean, I like people like that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But let's not carry this too far. Let's not take our antipathy for the establishment, for these institutions like the church and like the academy, to denigrate them entirely at the expense of what the text is actually doing,
Right.
at the expense of history,
Right.
at the expense of literature.
If you're to paint it another way, if all of the facts and evidence do follow the facts, follow the evidence, do it honorably.
Yeah.
Don't manipulate, bend, twist, gymnastic, do all this kind of stuff in order to denigrate. Look, we can all face the horrid crimes that the church has committed by priests and the way that
Yeah.
they shift priests to new locations rather than completely make sure they have nothing to do with the positions they held of power.
Exactly. Yes.
You and I both know the power of leadership in church and cult-like settings and how they can manipulate people who are in less statuses, like they're in a lower status, and there's all sorts of stuff that goes on with that. But like that we can factually look at. I can't turn to I mean, I could find examples where maybe authority plays a significant role in the literature. I can't find a text. I just don't see it. I don't see
No.
a text that is encouraging that behavior. Therefore, I can't make the excuse of saying
Mhm.
the whole church is bankrupt because in Galatians chapter 2, Paul says we should all take little boys. And, like, I just don't see it,
If only it was there,
Right.
but unfortunately, it's not. We have to work harder.
And I don't think if imagine we found, I guess, a good connection if you're being forensic and actually technically accurate, is if we found a class of priests that were behaving in this manner, interpreting the gospels
Yeah.
that way,
Yep.
then maybe, but we don't even have
Don't
that.
even have that.
No, I think what's happening, and a better solution is here you have these people vowing to stay celibate
Mhm.
when in reality they cannot. They are not built and capable of self restraint in order to do such a thing. So maybe some purposely found the job useful for that kind of
Mhm.
obsession. Maybe some were obsessed and were forcibly in their own mind without self-control following the easy path of how can I get away with these kinds of things. There's probably several other ways in which this plays its role, but it's not the Gospel of Mark gives you the blueprint. You know what I mean? Like,
It's not that.
yeah,
So maybe finishing up, there's one more thing I need to say.
I keep bringing it out of you.
I am not a lay stace.
Thank you so much, Kip.
Yeah, absolutely.